I want to introduce to you our speaker tonight, John Gentry, Senior Architectural Historian with EHT Traceries. He will be presenting tonight's finding. Please help me offer a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Gentry. I'm a Senior Architectural Historian with EHT Traceries. I'm joined this evening by my colleagues Alyssa Stein, Senior Project Manager, and Danny Michelson, Conservation Specialist. We are a woman-owned historic preservation consulting firm located in Washington, D.C. We work on a wide range of government and private sector clients in areas such as preservation planning, historic tax credits, technical preservation services, survey and documentation, and environmental sustainability. We're really excited to be part of this research effort for the city. And with that brief intro out of the way, I will go ahead and dive into this evening's presentation. And first, we're going to talk about the introduction of slavery in colonial Maryland. The history of slavery in Maryland traces back to the mid-17th century during the colonial period. During this period, slavery in Maryland was linked to the growth of agriculture, particularly tobacco cultivation in the eastern counties. Maryland's economy and social structure gradually became intertwined with the institution of slavery, which evolved in response to economic demands and labor shortages. Understanding this evolution requires examining early labor models, demographic changes, and the development of agricultural economies in the early colony. Therefore, the first part of this presentation explores how slavery was introduced, codified, expanded, and propagated in Maryland's formative years. Initially, Maryland's labor force was dominated not by enslaved Africans, but by indentured servants, largely young men from England and Ireland. These servants signed contracts agreeing to work typically 4 to 7 years in exchange for transportation to Maryland, along with food, lodging, and land after their services. This model reflected English manorial traditions, as land grants awarded for transporting servants incentivized a landed aristocracy in the colony. Maryland's early economy functioned predominantly through this system, which reigned throughout much of the 17th century. Though indentured servitude predominated early labor, enslaved Africans were introduced to Maryland in 1642, arriving at St. Mary's City. Despite their relatively small numbers, before the late 17th century, less than 1,000 enslaved individuals arrived between 1619 and 1697. The enslaved population was culturally diverse. Many came directly from areas in Africa, such as the Gold Coast, while others arrived from areas in the Caribbean, such as the Windward Islands. These enslaved people brought varied cultural traditions, languages, and skills, influencing the colony's evolving society. Tobacco emerged as the fundamental crop underpinning Maryland's economic prosperity in the 17th century. Tobacco cultivation was extremely labor-intensive, requiring persistent field work, curing, and processing. Initially, this labor demand was met through indentured servants, but as availability of indentured servants declined due to changing economic conditions in Europe and the end of their contracts, plantation owners increasingly turned to enslaved Africans. Maryland enacted laws in the 1660s that transformed slavery into a hereditary, lifelong condition, shifting from temporary servitude to permanent racialized bondage that made enslaved people chattel property. These laws imposed harsh controls, restricting property rights and personal freedoms, and shaped the landscape of enforced labor. The late 17th century marked a significant increase in slavery's scale in Maryland. In 1698, the end of the English Royal African Company's monopoly authorized independent merchants to directly import enslaved Africans, dramatically increasing the colony's enslaved population. Maryland transitioned from a frontier society with limited slavery to one deeply reliant on enslaved labor for plantation agriculture, particularly tobacco. Plantation owners consolidated land holdings and their socioeconomic power, while enslaved workers filled these expanding operations. The colony's laws facilitated the buying, selling, and movement of enslaved individuals, entrenching slavery within the economic and social fabric of Maryland through the 18th century. As the slave population grew, there was a notable demographic transition. Increasingly, the majority of enslaved individuals were native-born within Maryland, descendants of Africans brought decades earlier. Slavery became distinctly hereditary as children born to enslaved mothers inherited their slave status. This generational replication embedded slavery deeply within Maryland society, made it an enduring system into the 18th century and the founding of the city of Frederick. The diversity of the early African arrivals evolved into a more uniform enslaved society. However, cultural retention and community leadership within enslaved quarters helped preserve African traditions and social networks despite the oppressive system. Next, we're going to talk about the founding of the city of Frederick and the introduction of slavery. Frederick County, located in northern Maryland, was formed in 1748 as part of the colony's westward expansion. Unlike Maryland's eastern counties, characterized by large tobacco plantations, Frederick County was situated on a largely unsettled frontier during the 17th and early 18th centuries. Early European settlers were drawn to this region for its fertile land suited to grains such as wheat and corn. This geographic and economic distinction shaped the development of the county's enslavement practices, setting it somewhat apart from the plantation economies of southern and eastern Maryland. Nevertheless, by 1755, there were 1,776 enslaved persons in Frederick County, as well as 157 free blacks. The city of Frederick was founded in 1745 by Daniel Delaney, who laid out the town on part of a tract known as Tasker's Chance. Delaney envisioned Frederick as a regional market town that would serve the surrounding agricultural community, especially grain farmers. The town quickly became an essential commercial hub due to its strategic location near major land routes known as the Monocacy Roads. These roads facilitated east-west and north-south travel, connecting Frederick to larger cities and regions and reinforcing its role as a center for trade and transportation. Over time, Frederick expanded its local infrastructure with mills, tanneries, breweries, and other industries that processed agricultural products like wheat and grains, strengthening its economy and importance in the region. Slavery arrived gradually in Frederick County in the city of Frederick, slower than other parts of Maryland. And this was partly because many early settlers were German farmers and tradesmen who did not have the same cultural dependence on slavery as English settlers. Despite the slower start, enslaved individuals lived and worked within the city during the colonial period and remained integral to Frederick's economy through the 19th century. Unlike broader county trends showing a decline in enslaved populations due to changing agricultural practices, manumissions, and the sale of enslaved people to the Deep South, the city of Frederick experienced a slight increase in the number of enslaved people from 392 in 1825 to 439 by 1860. The enslaved community included men, women, and children of various age groups. For example, in 1825, there were 81 children aged 8 to 14, 84 men aged 15 to 45, 104 women aged 15 to 36, and 123 children under 8 or older adults. By 1860, the numbers adjusted slightly, with 87 children aged 8 to 14, 84 enslaved men, 123 women aged 15 to 36, and 145 children under 8 plus older adults. This varied population worked in multiple capacities throughout the city, supporting the economic and social structures of Frederick. And now we're going to transition to a discussion of the institution of slavery in the city of Frederick. We structured our context and our research along the lines of the institution of slavery and also the lives of the enslaved, those two thematic categories. And so first we're going to talk about the institution of slavery. The institution of slavery was a legal, economic, social, cultural, and political framework that depended on the ownership and exploitation of enslaved people. Although the vast majority of the city of Frederick's citizens were not enslavers, the institution nevertheless permeated all parts of society, influencing legislation, media, social norms, and the economy. The system of chattel slavery primarily benefited a small class of wealthy elites, as well as some middle-class merchants and tradespeople who were active in the exploitation of humans for financial gain. The legal and disciplinary regime in Frederick was explicitly designed to maintain the institution of slavery and subordinate both enslaved and free black individuals. The Frederick County Courthouse, located at Courthouse Square, served as the central venue for legal proceedings involving enslaved people. Adjacent to the courthouse was a public whipping post situated at the southeast corner of the courthouse lot, the exact site now occupied by Frederick City Hall. This whipping post was a standard mechanism for corporal punishment, publicly meted out to enslaved individuals for perceived crimes or disobedience. For example, in 1823, William Patterson, a formerly enslaved man, was publicly whipped for stealing rye from his master. Likewise, Samuel Queen received 30 lashes in 1826 for stealing food items. In February of 1861, a public sale of a mixed-race woman and her 2 children, described as, quote, slaves for life, was advertised in a local newspaper and held in the square. The outcome of this sale and what happened to this mother and her children is not known. However, this sale, like many others, represents the commodification of human lives and the disruption of families that was a hallmark of slavery. The courthouse square, in this context, functioned as a marketplace where the lives of enslaved individuals were bartered and sold, further entrenching the institution of slavery within the community. Operating in coordination with the county jail, so-called sheriff's sales were held in the courthouse square to facilitate the sale of jailed African Americans at public auction to the highest bidder. One such sale, posted in a newspaper by Joseph M. Cromwell, the sheriff of Frederick County, advertised John Fagan, a black man of about 27 years of age. These sales were not only a means of punishment, but also a method of economic exploitation, as the proceeds from these auctions often went to cover the cost of imprisonment or other debts. Originally, the county jail was located on the courthouse square in downtown Frederick. It was later moved to the western end of South Street in 1815. The former jail building at 419 West South Street, which is pictured here at left, is currently on the site, and the building was completed in 1876. The Frederick Jail operated as a punitive institution, not only through incarceration, but also enabling public executions and corporal punishments, such as whippings, often staged near or within the jail yard, as well as at the courthouse. And also, like the courthouse, the jail functioned not only a place of confinement, but also as a venue for auctions and sales. The Frederick County Orphans Court used the jail as a public auction site, including the sale of enslaved children, which is hard to wrap your head around. For example, in 1838, a 17-year-old enslaved girl was sold, quote, at the door of the jail under court authority. Enslaved people were also visibly confined at the jail under harsh conditions. The city of Frederick played a significant role in the regional slave trade, despite lacking a formal centralized auction market specifically designated for enslaved persons. Its geographic location as a nexus of major thoroughfares and stagecoach routes, coupled with its status as the commercial center for Frederick County, made it an important hub for the buying and selling of enslaved individuals. Maryland's northern counties, including Frederick County, experienced a decreased reliance on slavery as the 19th century progressed due to a transition to greater agricultural diversification. The rise of cotton cultivation in the Deep South rapidly increased demand for enslaved labor in that region. This demand pulled enslaved people from border states like Maryland into an expanding interstate slave trade. Slave traders in the region, sometimes derisively called quote-unquote soul drivers by abolitionists and critics, forcibly moved enslaved people over long distances, often hundreds of miles, away from their places of birth. Such removals routinely severed familial and social ties, separating individuals from parents, children, siblings, spouses, and close friends, thereby inflicting profound psychological and emotional suffering. Slave trading activities were carried out across various venues in the city of Frederick, including private residences, taverns, hotels, the city jail, and the courthouse. Among these, the Union Tavern stood out as a particularly active center for slave sales. Today the site of a bank, it was originally situated on the southeast corner of Patrick and Market Streets. The Union Tavern was operated by Captain Nicholas Turbert and was frequently used as a site where enslaved persons were bought and sold. This tavern, along with others such as Mayberry's Tavern, Joshua Murray's Tavern, Mr. Talbot's City Hotel, and the National Hotel, hosted numerous auctions and facilitated transactions that were often advertised in local newspapers throughout the early 19th century. The prominence of these taverns as auction sites is evident from contemporary advertisements. For example, as early as 1799, an anonymous advertisement appeared in the Fredericktown Herald offering cash payment for young Negroes of either sex, directing interested parties to Mayberry's Tavern. Similarly, in 1831, Jason A. Durham placed an advertisement expressing his desire to purchase 30, quote, young Negroes, male or female, from the ages of 6 to 25 years at Joshua Murray's Tavern. These advertisements reflected the ongoing and organized nature of the slave trade in Frederick, targeting primarily young enslaved people. And now we want to look at a story of resistance. This is the Baker House. It's a 2.5-story brick mansion situated at 35 Church Street, and the house was constructed for William Schley around 1826, although deed records suggest that there was already a house on the property prior to his ownership. William Schley was known to have enslaved several individuals during his ownership of the house. The 1830 federal census lists Schley as enslaving 8 people, which was a good bit more than the average resident of Fredericktown. The census records him as enslaving 1 boy under the age of 10 years old, 1 boy between 10 and a male individual between 10 and 23 years old, 1 man between 36 and 54 years old, 1 girl between 10 years old, 1 female between 10 and 23 years old, 2 women between 23 and 35 years old, and 1 woman between 36 and 54 years old, which that's a little wonky, but that's the way the slave census breaks down in terms of these age categories. The Baker House represents the courage and resilience of enslaved individuals, such as Leonard, an enslaved man who bravely sought freedom. Leonard was a domestic servant that occasionally served as a coachman, and he escaped from the Baker House in 1827 when he was 22 or 23 years old. Following his escape, his enslaver, William Schley, published an advertisement in the Fredericktown Herald seeking the apprehension of Leonard. In addition to providing a detailed physical description of the man, Schley reported that Leonard had absconded with several of Schley's nicer garments. Leonard's story of seeking freedom is not unique. However, its documentation provides the opportunity to interpret the Baker House as a site that exemplifies the resistance to the institution of slavery from the enslaved. His escape underscores the danger that freedom seekers faced, as evidenced by the newspaper advertisements that sought their capture. It also represents the stories of freedom seekers that will likely never be known, as any further information about those who escape is often never found. The only evidence that remains of these brave individuals is the newspaper advertisements seeking their capture. The Baker House, therefore, stands as a testament to the courage of individuals like Leonard and the perilous journey they undertook in their quest for freedom, highlighting the resilience of determination of those who dared to seek a better life despite the immense risks involved. This is the Potts House, built circa 1818 for an individual named Richard Potts, who was a prominent citizen of Frederick. He was an enslaver, and he was also the vice president of the Frederick County Colonization Society, or FCCS. The house is located at 100 North Court Street. The Potts House serves as a compelling setting to narrate the story of the Frederick County Colonization Society, reflecting the complex and often contradictory attitudes towards race and slavery that we see in early 19th century Maryland. Established in 1820 as a county-level auxiliary of the American Colonization Society, or ACS, the Frederick County Colonization Society aimed to address the perceived problem, quote-unquote problem, of free black individuals by promoting their immigration to Liberia, which was a colony founded by the ACS on the west coast of Africa in the early 1820s. Supporters of colonization believed that the coexistence of different races was problematic and that the presence of a free black population posed a challenge to the institution of slavery, thereby undermining the racial ideologies that upheld the system. Members of the ACS espoused the argument that relocating free black individuals to Africa would allow them to enjoy a better life, free from the prejudices of American society. Apart from his position as vice president of the society, Richard Potts played a significant role in carrying out the mission of the SCCS. According to the Index of Frederick County, Maryland slave manumissions, Potts manumitted or set free 11 enslaved persons between 1829 and 1860. However, in 1860, he continued to enslave one person and employed 3 free black individuals, all of whom lived on the Potts House property. Such nuanced differences highlight the complexities of how the society's members may have viewed the institution of slavery. A number of individuals are documented as having left Frederick County for Liberia, and the image we're seeing here is an American Colonization Society warehouse that was constructed in Monrovia, Liberia, and this photo was taken sometime in the 1860s. In 1833, William McKinney, an agent of the MCS, persuaded Jacob Gross, Rosanna Gross, and their children to immigrate to Liberia under the condition that they were manumitted from slavery. In 1838, a formerly enslaved man named Thomas Jackson, who had once been enslaved by Colonel John Ritchie of Frederick, returned from Liberia to address the congregation of the Lutheran Church of Frederick, providing first-hand testimony of life in the colony. In 1854, Henry Williams, who had been formerly enslaved by SCCS member John Markle, wrote to Frederick resident Jacob Engelbrecht, reporting that he had lost his wife and 3 children in Liberia. Frederick City newspapers played a key role in promoting and facilitating the institution of slavery. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Frederick was home to numerous weekly newspapers, including the Frederick Examiner, which had its offices at the southwest corner of Market and Church Streets, according to the 1854 Soxy illustration of Frederick. During the antebellum period, many of these newspapers published advertisements for the sale of enslaved individuals, information on freedom seekers to aid in their recapture, and general news on the legal and political aspects of slavery. They not only reflected the ongoing activities related to slavery, but also influenced the views of Frederick residents. The political affiliation of the newspapers significantly impacted their treatment and coverage of slavery. Democratic-leaning newspapers, such as the Frederick Herald and the Citizen, often used inflammatory language to support pro-slavery views, and showed strong loyalty to the Southern United States, especially during the Civil War. For instance, in 1861, Frederick Herald editor John Hurst asserted that remaining in the Union would require, quote, absolute submission to the Northern fanaticism, end quote. The dedication to the Southern cause was so absolute that military authorities banned the Citizen during the Civil War due to editor John W. Bauman's obstinate pro-Confederate editorial stance, subsequently exiling the Bauman family from Frederick into the South. And this is a photo of the building that housed the Frederick Examiner. And then this is a detailed view from that bird's eye view that I referenced earlier, the 1854 Soxie bird's eye view. At lower center, the white building that you see at lower center next to the church is the Frederick Examiner building. So you can see that's what it looks like today, and then you can see there it is in the drawing. The Frederick Examiner building can be seen at lower left in this detail from the 1854 bird's eye. Republican-affiliated newspapers in Frederick, while more sympathetic to anti-slavery views, did not outright condemn the institution. The Republican Frederick Examiner, the most pro-union paper in the county, declared its support for, quote, our cherished institutions, end quote, and vowed to uphold, quote, the interests and institutions of the South, end quote, in 1860. The Frederick Examiner and its contemporaries not only reflected the societal norms of the time, but also actively shared public opinion. The political affiliations of these newspapers further influenced their stance on slavery, with the Democratic-leaning papers ardently supporting the Southern cause, while Republican-leaning papers like the Frederick Examiner offering a more nuanced view. And it's a little confusing at that time. What we think of today as Democrat and Republican parties were actually kind of reversed. So now we want to transition to talk about the theme of the lives of the enslaved. In urban environments such as the city of Frederick, the daily lives of enslaved individuals often intersected with those of free black people and white citizens. Urban enslaved people were more visible in public spaces, contributing to the daily life of the city. Their presence in markets, streets, and public events made them a visible part of the urban landscape, which contrasted with the lives of enslaved people in rural areas who were relatively isolated. The overlapping lives of white and enslaved individuals in densely populated urban areas created challenges for maintaining social decorum. White residents were often concerned about the proper racial boundaries and the potential for social mixing. Efforts to keep daily routines separate were evident in the way urban enslavers structured their households and managed the interactions between their enslaved workers and their own family life. The lives of the enslaved in the city of Frederick encompassed a number of themes. Enslaved individuals in the city labored in a variety of settings, from domestic servants to hotel staff and industrial workers. They lived in humble accommodations, either within their owner's household or in separate quarters. The enslaved worshiped in churches established during the late 18th to early 19th centuries by the city's free blacks, and in some cases, enslaved persons attended Frederick's white churches. While there were few educational opportunities for the enslaved in the city of Frederick, the monotony of their lives was occasionally brightened by social events such as fairs, holidays, and religious meetings. Urban living quarters of the enslaved contrasted sharply with those of enslaved people in rural areas. While enslaved people in rural areas were usually housed in separate quarters far from the main house of their enslaver, enslaved people in urban areas, such as Frederick, often lived in closer proximity to their enslavers, typically within the same household or in nearby quarters, in an arrangement that facilitated surveillance by the enslavers. This was made possible due to the relatively small number of slaves held by enslavers residing in the city of Frederick. The majority of Frederick enslavers held 3 or less people in bondage. Quarters for the enslaved were often constructed on the rear edge of lots and formed what was known as a plantation compound, with the main dwelling house and a central yard space. The Ross Mansion, pictured here, located at 105 Council Street, is perhaps the best extant example of the urban plantation compound typology in the city of Frederick. The plantation compound typology was relatively rare in Frederick because it required larger lot sizes, which was a luxury that not many could afford in an urban context at that period of time. Constructed circa 1817 for John McPherson, a prominent local citizen and part owner of the Antietam Iron Works, the Ross Mansion included an impressive main house fronting Council Street, a two-story brick stable building fronting West 2nd Street, and a one-story brick wing extending from the stable along the property's western edge that was likely used as quarters for the enslaved workforce. The building, pictured here, features 3 original doorways and an old chimney likely used for cooking and heating during the winter months. These doorways might have once opened into 2 separate living areas with a distinct kitchen, but any interior walls that existed have been removed over time. Now, the space resembles a long 6-foot wide hallway, highlighting the restrictive size of the space where 7 or 8 people would have lived. In 1820, McPherson's enslaved workforce consisted of 7 people, 1 woman over 45 years of age, 1 man aged 26 to 44, 2 young women aged 14 to 25, 1 girl under 14 years old, and 2 boys under 14 years old. In 1825, McPherson manumitted a man named Thomas Bell, described as being about 42 years old. McPherson died in 1829, at which point his property, including his enslaved workforce, passed to his son, John McPherson Jr. In 1830, the federal census listed that he enslaved 8 people, 1 girl under 10 years of age, 2 young men, a middle-aged man, 3 young women, and 1 middle-aged woman. In 1833, 2 young men, freedom seekers named Nat and Lewis, escaped from the Ross house, prompting McPherson to publish a runaway advertisement in the Daily National Intelligencer. Enslaved people residing within the city of Frederick most commonly occupied secondary spaces that were within or attached to the main house. Constructed in the late 18th century, the Roger Brooke Taney House, located at 121 South Bent Street, features a significant extant example of living quarters where enslaved individuals likely lived, offering a glimpse into their lives and the conditions they endured. The configuration of the Roger Brooke Taney House also represents an adaptation of what we call the telescope house form constructed on a narrow urban lot. And if you look at this image, on the right-hand side, you can see the wing extending from the back of the main house, which we'll take a closer look at in just a moment. Although service wings were documented in the mid-Atlantic in the early 1700s, they generally did not become common features until the mid-18th century. On rural farms, service wings often were strung out in a long, attenuated plan that architectural historians have referred to as the telescope house, described as such because the height of the building descended from the main house, which was the tallest section, to the lower wings housing enslaved persons, the kitchen, and things like storerooms. Service wings typically contained between 1 and 3 rooms, which were aligned front to back or side to side, depending on the form of the wing and its orientation to the main house. The construction of service wings, which physically segregated the enslaved workforce, reinforced the power dynamics inherent in the institution of slavery. And this is a closer look at the service wing from an old early 20th century postcard. The service wing runs perpendicular to the rear elevation of the Taney House. It's 9 bays long, which is kind of a wonky term that we use to just refer to the number of window and door openings. It's rectangular in plan and is topped by a slate gable roof with overhang and exposed rafters. It contained a kitchen with a fireplace, a wine cellar beneath the kitchen, a smokehouse, a workroom, and a sleeping loft above that likely served as the sleeping quarters for the enslaved. The Taney House, including the rear service wing, was restored in the 1960s when the property was converted into a house museum named in honor of Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney, who delivered the majority opinion in the landmark Dred Scott v. Sanford case in 1857. It is unlikely that Taney ever lived in the house. Instead, he acted as a landlord alongside John McPherson, who seems to turn up all over Frederick history. The residents most associated with the house were Elizabeth Luckett and later a man named Peter Mance. Elizabeth Luckett purchased the property in 1801. According to the 1800 federal census, Luckett enslaved 7 people, which was a larger enslaved workforce than that of the average resident of Frederick. The size of the enslaved workforce likely necessitated housing for enslaved workers outside of the main residence. In 1807, Luckett placed an advertisement in a newspaper offering a $20 reward for the return of an enslaved man named Jack, who was in the service of John Bryan at the Antietam Mills, suggesting that not all of Luckett's enslaved workers lived within the Taney house. Jack was described in the advertisement as a carpenter by trade, well-built at 5'9" or 10", with a strong voice and scars on his face. The advertisement also highlighted his skills at playing the violin. Local carpenter Peter Mance took ownership of the property in 1823. The 1830 slave assessment records indicate that Mance enslaved 1 woman over the age of 55, and the 1840 federal census records Mance as enslaving 1 male between the age of 10 and 23 years old. The Taney House served as a museum until 2021. It was dedicated to educating visitors about Taney, the history of slavery, and the lives of the people who were enslaved there. Specifically, the rear wing provided an opportunity to see an interpretation of the living quarters and the conditions endured by the enslaved. The house is now privately owned and is no longer open as an educational site. This is the Enoch Lewis Low House, which is located at 100 East 2nd Street. And it provides another example of the telescope house used to describe service wings that were strung out in a long plan. The house was owned by Victoire Vincentière and her sister Adelaide Lowe, who at one time were the largest enslavers in Frederick County. The Enoch Lewis Lowe House represents the lives and struggles of the enslaved who labored for the wealthy and powerful Vincentière family. Although the property was confined, several service wings ranging from 1 to 2 stories in height that likely housed enslaved servants were constructed to the rear of the main dwelling. This arrangement addressed the problem of incorporating service into the house while segregating it from the owner's living spaces. The Vincentière family fled the slave uprisings in the French West Indian colony of Saint Dominique in the early 1790s, and in 1794, they acquired the 457-acre tract of what would one day make up the L'Hermitage Plantation, where the family originally resided before moving into the city of Frederick. Despite being unmarried and only 19 years of age, Victoire Vincentière owned and operated a large plantation that had one of the highest numbers of enslaved individuals in the county. According to the 1800 census, Vincentière was listed as the head of the household, comprising 18 family members and guests, which seemingly included various other Saint Dominique refugees and 90 enslaved laborers. In 1828, Vincentière sold the plantation and moved to Fredericktown with her sister Adelaide and her nephew Enoch Lowe. Despite selling or possibly manumitting most of her enslaved workforce when she sold the plantation, Victoire Vincentière continued to enslave a few people while living in Frederick. The 1835 City of Frederick tax list indicates that at that time, she owned 1 female and 1 male enslaved person between the ages of 14 and 36. 15 years later, the 1850 federal census lists 1 17-year-old male enslaved person in the household. After Victoire's death in 1854, Adelaide inherited the house. In 1861, she conveyed ownership to her son, who had already been residing there. Enoch Lowe, who served as the governor of Maryland from 1851 to 1854, did not retain ownership of the house for long. As a Southern sympathizer, he fled to Virginia in 1861 when it became evident that Maryland would not secede from the Union. In Frederick, enslaved persons worked in a variety of fields, including domestic, commercial, and industrial labor. Although enslaved people accounted for a relatively small percentage of Frederick's total population, their labor often took them into the street and in public places. Enslaved people of all ages and genders worked in the domestic capacity for wealthy residents, cooking, cleaning, running errands, and driving coaches. Women often developed specialized skills such as spinning, weaving, or sewing. Many men labored as skilled tradesmen, working for merchants and artisans in the city or industrial establishments. By the mid-18th century, the city of Frederick boasted a small industrial center located along Carroll Creek, South Carroll Street, and East Street, with industries such as sawmilling, blacksmithing, tanning, brickmaking, limestone quarrying, flour milling, and distilling. Among the largest and most prominent of the tanneries in Frederick were those owned by the Byerly family. Frederick Byerly, who migrated from Pennsylvania to Frederick in 1776, operated 2 tanneries in the area until his death. His widow, Elizabeth, subsequently divided the business between their sons, Valentine and Louis Byerly. Elizabeth Byerly is recorded in the 1826 tax list as enslaving 1 working-age male identified as a tanner, indicating the use of enslaved labor at the family's tanneries. Louis Byerly was also assessed for 1 working-age enslaved male in the same year. By 1835, Louis Byerly enslaved 4 working-age males, aged 15 to 45, all noted as tanners in the tax records. Louis Byerly's tannery, which he inherited from his parents, was located on the south side of Patrick Street, east of Carroll Street, and is pictured here in this image. After his death in 1858, the tannery was passed to his son, George K. Byerly. The tannery is illustrated on the 1858 bond map of Frederick. Unlike his predecessors, George Byerly did not own enslaved people. His employees were paid for their labor. The tannery remained in the Byerly family until 1960, when the business closed. The existing remnants of the Louis George Byerly Tannery building primarily date to the 20th century, although there are portions of the building constructed of uncoursed fieldstone that likely date to the mid-19th century. The Valentine Byerly Tannery was demolished. It was originally situated on the south side of Patrick Street, west of Carroll Street, near Carroll Creek, in the vicinity of what is now the rear of the Seaber Arts Library and the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. In the 1835 tax list, Valentine Byerly is documented as enslaving 4 working-age men, all described as tanners, so we know that they worked in the tannery. The 1850 Federal Census Slave Schedule lists Valentine Byerly as enslaving 8 individuals, including 6 men and 2 women, aged between 2 and 40 years old. It is highly likely that some of these individuals labored at the tannery, contributing to its operations. The National Hotel, owned by Michael Zimmerman in the 19th century and located at the intersection of Church and Court Street, likely that several, if not all, of these servants were actually enslaved by Zimmerman. The roles of these enslaved individuals at the National Hotel would have presumably been varied and demanding. They likely performed a range of tasks ranging from cooking and cleaning to attending to guests and maintaining the hotel's facilities. The hotel's operations would have depended on the work of these enslaved people. In 1864, as the Civil War was drawing to a close and the institution of slavery was beginning to be dismantled, Zimmerman sought compensation for 4 formerly enslaved individuals. This request was documented in the 1864 Slave Statistics, where Zimmerman listed 3 of these individuals: John T. Dorsey, age 23, Frank Fisher, age 19, and a young boy named James, age 6, as having labored at the hotel in 1860. The 1860 census identifies these individuals as being among the black and mixed-race domestic servants that lived and worked at the hotel. At that time, the federal census rarely listed enslaved individuals by name, which makes this case particularly unique. Opportunities for enslaved people to receive education in Frederick was very limited. Although Maryland was one of the few states that did not pass legislation outright forbidding education for enslaved persons, Maryland enslavers generally discouraged or forbade enslaved persons from learning to read or write. Literacy was viewed as a threat for multiple reasons, in part because it provided the enslaved with skills such as forging travel passes that could be useful during an attempted escape. The St. John's Academy of Frederick, also known as the Free School and St. John's Female Benevolent School, provided education to the city of Frederick's black population prior to the Civil War. Associated with St. John's Catholic Church, the Free School was founded by the Sisters of Charity under the guidance of Father McElroy in 1824. Like St. John's Church, the Academy welcomed students of all races and was active in its conversion efforts. Free Black people are confirmed to have attended the school, but research has not uncovered any concrete evidence that enslaved Black people were students at St. John's. In 1846, following a fire at the St. John's Academy of Frederick, the administration of the rebuilt school, shown here, was undertaken by the Sisters of the Visitation of Georgetown, who moved up to Frederick and were involved in the ownership and sale of enslaved people. Therefore, it's doubtful that enslaved Blacks were educated during their operation of the school. This is the Quinn Chapel AME Church. And by 1845, the church was holding religious classes in its Sabbath school with 2 teachers and 25 students. Presumably, these students were members of the free Black community, as educating enslaved persons would have been a very dangerous undertaking for any African-American congregation at that time. After the Civil War, Black churches took much of the responsibility for educating formerly enslaved persons. Beginning in 1865, the African Civilization Society, a Brooklyn, New York-based benevolent organization, began operating a school in the basement of the Quinn Chapel AME Church. The society soon opened a second school in the basement of the Asbury Methodist Episcopal Church. Beginning in 1866, these schools were later operated by the Freedmen's Bureau. Initial reports by the school to the Freedmen's Bureau indicate that it boasted an attendance of between 30 and 55 students during its first year. In Frederick County, the enslaved population had limited opportunities to spend their free time, which they often used to assert their identities beyond mere commodities. Some enslavers allowed their workers time off, recognizing the importance of rest and social interaction for maintaining productivity and morale. This time off was sometimes granted for specific occasions, such as a reward for good behavior. Enslaved individuals on rural farms and plantations were, in some cases, permitted to travel into Frederick and other county towns, where they could make purchases and interact with free Black people and other enslaved people. This mobility was crucial for their social lives, as it allowed them to participate in the local economy, buy goods, and maintain relationships with family and friends. And in his 1910 History of the City of Frederick, Thomas John Chew Williams noted that a large African-American fair in which both free and enslaved took part was held in the city of Frederick in 1859. In addition, Whit Monday, celebrated the day after the Christian Pentecost holiday, was another important occasion for the Black community in Frederick. It was marked by picnics and gatherings that allowed enslaved individuals and free Black people to come together in a festive atmosphere. These events were often supervised by white police officers to ensure order, but they still provided a rare opportunity for the enslaved to enjoy leisure time, socialize, and participate in communal activities. Religion was another important part of enslaved African American culture. During the first quarter of the 19th century, religious practices were ostensibly promoted by enslavers, believing that it would result in a more obedient, pacified workforce. Other enslavers saw a moral responsibility to provide religious instruction. On some plantations, enslaved persons attended the Sabbath schools and worship services that were organized for them by the plantation owner. In other cases, the enslaved were allowed to form churches. Following the failed slave uprising led by Black preacher Nat Turner, which occurred in Southampton County, Virginia during the summer of 1831, plantation owners sought to exercise greater control over how the enslaved worshiped. A law passed by the Maryland General Assembly in 1831 made it unlawful for Black people, whether free or enslaved, to assemble or attend any religious meeting unless conducted by a white, licensed, or ordained minister, or by some other white person authorized by the pastor. Prior to the Civil War, Frederick had several churches where free and enslaved Black people worshiped, with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME, being the oldest and most organized Black congregation. The AME Church originated from the Free African Society, founded in Philadelphia in 1787 by Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and others in response to racial discrimination experienced at St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church, where Black worshipers were forcibly removed during prayer. The Quinn Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church, pictured here at 106 East 3rd Street, is the oldest African American congregation in the city of Frederick, first established in the late 1790s by a group of freedmen. The original church at this location was constructed in 1819, which is the building that we see here. It was rebuilt in 1878 and later remodeled in 1923 to achieve the appearance that we saw earlier in the previous slide. The church served as a makeshift Union Army hospital during the Civil War. Following the war, the church housed the first Black school in the city of Frederick. The Lutheran Church in Frederick had a complex and evolving relationship with slavery throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Early on, key figures like Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, considered the patriarch of American Lutheranism, ministered to both free and enslaved African Americans and expressed a critical view of slavery, despite holding typical racial attitudes of the period that placed whites at the top of a racial hierarchy. Evidence suggests that Frederick's Lutheran Church engaged in ministry to the town's African American community during the 18th and 19th centuries. Starting in 1777, under the pastorate of John Andrew Krug, a significant number of enslaved individuals were baptized, with records indicating that over 70 children and adult enslaved persons were baptized by him until the end of his pastorate in 1794. In 1811, the Reverend David Schaefer, pastor of the Frederick Lutheran Congregation from 1808 until 1836, received instruction from the church council that a local mixed-race girl be confirmed and allowed to take communion in the church. On November 25, 1824, Frederick chronicler Jacob Engelbrecht noted that Adam Coors, a Black man who was a confirmed member of the Lutheran Church of this town, had died. Coors was buried in the Lutheran graveyard with all the rights and privileges of a Lutheran. He had formerly been enslaved by Michael Romer, one of the founders of the church, and Engelbrecht notes that Coors, quote, assisted in building the church in, quote, 1754 or 55. In 1834, Engelbrecht recorded that Jehu Jones, a Black Lutheran minister from Philadelphia, had preached in the Lutheran church in Frederick. Engelbrecht later noted in 1837 that, quote, a Black girl named Mary, living or belonging to Mr. Thomas W. Morgan, had been baptized and confirmed in the Lutheran church. She was, along with Adam Coors, one of only two enslaved persons that we have confirmation of as members of the church by this date, according to Engelbrecht. In a 1930s oral history interview for the Federal Writers Project, James Wiggins stated that in 1863, his enslaver, quote, Mr. Stone, a member of the Lutheran Church, had me christened, giving me the name of James Wiggins. And the story of James Wiggins is actually very interesting. He was originally from Anne Arundel County, and his owner liquidated his holdings of enslaved persons, and he was transported to Baltimore. And then he was, with the aid of some folks in Baltimore, was able to escape from a holding house in Baltimore and came to Frederick, where he was baptized. It's kind of an interesting story. Free and enslaved persons in Frederick County also practiced Catholicism, beginning in the mid-18th century. Father John Williams commissioned the construction of a community house in the city of Frederick in 1763-64, which was the first Catholic place of worship in Frederick County. In the late 18th century, Father John Dubois, a refugee from the French Revolution, settled in the city of Frederick and became active in the recruitment and conversion of, quote, servants and children, end quote, throughout the county, presumably including those held in bondage by Catholic enslavers. In 1800, Father Dubois spearheaded the construction of the first Catholic church constructed in Fredericktown. These efforts were supported by members of the wealthy and powerful Vincentière family, French Catholic immigrants from Haiti. The Church of St. John, located on the present-day Chapel Alley between 2nd and 3rd Streets, was initially a modest brick building. Although home to a growing congregation of Catholics, the church was never completed in full and suffered from a lack of funding and structural issues. In 1824, the Daughters of Charity, which was an order of Catholic nuns from Emmitsburg, established a convent at St. John's. The convent building is part of the present-day Visitation Hotel Frederick. And this is the later church that St. John's congregation built. And this is a drawing of it here. In 1822, Irish-born priest Father McElroy relocated from Georgetown to Frederick and was instrumental in the growth of the church. During his first years in Frederick, McElroy traveled around the county to visit the extents of his parish. In 1827, he recorded the baptism of an enslaved man in the county, indicating that the church continued its conversion efforts for the enslaved population. In 1829, McElroy began planning for the construction of a new church in the city of Frederick, which we see here. And that church was completed in 1833. McElroy's diary entries reveal that the church was home to a diverse congregation for the time. In addition to Catholics, McElroy welcomed other denominations into the pews. Free and enslaved black churchgoers attended alongside white members and even raised money in support of the church. McElroy was also instrumental in the establishment of several Catholic organizations in town, including an asylum for orphans, a free school known as the St. John's Academy of Frederick, as well as a literary academy for the education of boys. These schools catered to a diverse church-going body. Notably, African Americans were permitted to attend the free school. Free and enslaved African Americans were buried at a number of cemeteries in Frederick. The largest, the Laboring Sons Cemetery, was established in 1851 as the burial site for the Beneficial Society of Laboring Sons of Frederick. This benevolent organization was formed in 1839 to provide a proper burial for free black people and laborers of modest means. It is located on a block-long tract on the west side of Chapel Alley between 5th and 6th Streets in the northeastern section of downtown Frederick. The cemetery is believed to have had around 1,500 burials, including at least 5 soldiers from the United States colored troops. However, no visible remnants of the cemetery remain today. By the 1940s, membership had waned, and the Beneficial Society of Laboring Sons had become inactive. Without active members, the cemetery fell into disrepair. Rather than preserving it as a burial ground, the city transformed the site into a whites-only park and playground in 1949. In 2000, following inquiries from local black community leaders and a local newspaper after construction nearby uncovered several graves, the city government discovered records in the Frederick Engineering Department that detailed the names and locations of the grave sites. In 2001, the Laboring Sons Memorial Committee, in partnership with the city of Frederick, dedicated the site as a memorial garden, now known as Laboring Sons Memorial Ground. The site was officially rededicated in 2003, featuring a granite monument that lists the names of 117 individuals buried there. The former All Saints Burial Ground, located on the site that is now addressed as 35 East All Saints Street in Frederick, also represents a historically important site for understanding African American enslavement and religious life in the city of Frederick. Although the burial ground no longer exists, the site remains significant in the context of African American life before the Civil War. Documentation of black congregants at All Saints Episcopal Church, free and enslaved, can be found from 1727 through 1863 through the church's parish registries. These registries record baptisms and burials of black congregants, which were significantly smaller in number when compared to white congregants. The largest documentation of baptisms, deaths, and burials for black congregants is found in the Third Parish Register book, which spans 1832 to 1863. Within this document is a section labeled Funerals, Colored, that lists African American congregants who died between 1846 and 1850 and were all buried in the colored people's graveyard. It's referred to in the document. This section of the graveyard was separated from the white section by a wall. In 1846, there were 2 burials: a 2-year-old girl who was buried by her parents on November 27th, and a 5-year-old girl who was buried by her parents on December 20th. In 1847, there were 4 burials: a 7-year-old boy, a 10-year-old boy, and a male and a female of unknown age. In 1914, the roughly 380 African Americans buried in All Saints were exhumed and relocated to Greenmount Cemetery, another African American cemetery in Frederick. It was thought that most of the bodies that were reinterred were people who labored for white families, buried on the other side of the dividing wall in the white section of the All Saints burial ground. In 2006, an apartment building was constructed on the site of the All Saints burial ground. Apologies, I skipped forward, but you saw the building that was pictured there. So in conclusion, the history of slavery in Maryland is a multifaceted narrative. It reflects broader national themes of economic dependency, social stratification, and the struggle for freedom. Throughout the state, the reliance on enslaved labor was deeply entrenched in the agricultural economy, particularly in the southern counties where plantation systems flourished. In contrast, northern Maryland, including Frederick County, experienced a gradual shift towards a more diverse economic base that reduced reliance on slavery, allowing for a burgeoning free black population engaged in various trades and occupations. Frederick County's unique geographical position between Virginia and Pennsylvania fostered a complex socio-political landscape influenced by both Southern traditions and Northern ideologies. This duality created tensions that were palpable as sectional conflicts over slavery intensified in the mid-19th century. The demographic shifts within Frederick County, marked by a declining enslaved population and an increasing number of free black people, mirrored the changing attitudes towards slavery and the growing momentum for emancipation. The Civil War catalyzed significant changes as the conflict not only altered the legal status of enslaved individuals, but also provided opportunities for escape and resistance. The Emancipation Proclamation and the subsequent adoption of the Maryland Constitution of 1864, which officially ended slavery in the state, marked pivotal moments in the fight for freedom. However, the post-emancipation era was fraught with challenges as racial violence and systemic oppression continued to hinder the progress of African Americans. Enslavement in the city of Frederick reflected these broader regional themes, as well as the factors that distinguished urban slavery from that of the more rural plantation settings. In urban settings like Frederick, the living arrangements for enslaved individuals varied based on the wealth and preferences of their enslavers. While some affluent enslavers could afford to provide separate quarters, most enslaved people lived in close proximity to their enslavers, often within the main residence or in small outbuildings, as we saw. This arrangement facilitated constant surveillance and control, reflecting the broader dynamics of power inherent in the institution of slavery. Enslaved labor was integral to the local economy, with individuals engaged in domestic, commercial, and industrial work, often visible in public spaces. Cultural and social institutions provided structure and meaning to the lives of Frederick's enslaved population. Churches and cemeteries served as important communal spaces for enslaved individuals in Frederick, and they fostered social connections and cultural practices. Education remained largely inaccessible, yet some enslaved people did seek out knowledge as a form of resistance. Social gatherings provided opportunities for community building, while acts of resistance, both subtle and overt, challenged the institution of slavery. The institution of slavery in Frederick was characterized by the ownership and exploitation of enslaved individuals, primarily benefiting a small class of wealthy enslavers while permeating all aspects of society. The auction and sale of enslaved individuals was a prevalent activity in Frederick, with local organizations and legal frameworks reinforcing the system of bondage. The decreased dependence on enslaved labor created an economic opportunity for human traffickers engaged in the domestic slave trade, who bought enslaved black people, or rather brought them from border states such as Maryland and sold them into slavery in the Deep South. The role of local newspapers, such as the Frederick Examiner and others, in promoting pro-slavery ideologies and facilitating the sale of enslaved individuals illustrates the societal acceptance and normalization of slavery within the community of Frederick at the time. Law and discipline were strictly enforced, often through harsh measures to maintain control over the enslaved population. Ultimately, the themes of separation, control, and societal complicity in the institution of slavery emerge as critical elements in understanding the lived experiences of enslaved individuals in Frederick. This exploitation not only sheds light on the historical context of slavery in the region, but also invites reflection on the lasting impacts of these practices on contemporary society. Little presentation here got quite messed up. But anyway, thank you very much. Are we taking questions, or? I'll do my best to answer.
We do have a microphone that we're going to pass around just so we capture this on video.
Did I read somewhere that this presentation was going to be on Maryland Public Television? Did I hear that?
Aware of that. Maybe others can clarify.
Maybe I might be having confused with some other presentation that I saw that somewhere.
I can help you with that rumor. So this is actively streaming on our website right now, and it will still be available on our YouTube channel with the City of Frederick. So do keep a lookout for that. Any information or follow-up that you want, please follow up with the City of Frederick's Planning Department. My business cards are outside, along with the QR codes, if you want access to that report. So thank you for your question.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Ann Hoffman, and I'm a professor at Frederick Community College. And my question comes from, I'm an English professor, so part-time historian. I'm wondering, how accurate are those census accountings? Like, can we count on them? The numbers seem low.
Yeah, it's a good question. Accuracy is always an issue when you're dealing with any historical records. So it's very likely that there may have been inaccuracies in the census records, but it is the best source of information that we have available to us today to be able to determine things like gender, age, and just the overall population in the city of Frederick and in the county. Yeah, and I will agree, the numbers in the city of Frederick were fairly low. I think it was only like 300 or 400 people on average between 1825 and 1860, whereas the county, I believe, was around 3,500 or so at its peak. So yeah, there was a discrepancy. But, as we discussed, it was a lot more labor intensive on plantations as opposed to in urban environments.
Hello, my name is Andy Solage. I have two questions. So one, when you were talking about the Low House, you mentioned a person in the family. I was wondering if you could spell the names of Victoire. I didn't catch the last name. Sendway.
Yeah, Vincendière. It's a French
okay.
name.
All right. Okay, perfect.
Vincendière, I think it's Vincendiere, Vincendière.
Okay, hold on.
Victoire Vincendière.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat the last name?
Yeah, sure. It's Vincendière. I believe it's Vincendierre, Diere.
Okay.
And they owned a plantation that was known as the Hermitage, or L'Hermitage in French. L'Hermitage.
Yeah. Okay. So
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, interesting. So this person and their family, they fled from Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution, or?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And so that was interesting. So they held one of the largest groups of enslaved people? Okay.
They did, and they were notorious for being some of the cruelest people in Frederick County.
That's what where I was going. What I wanted to ask about. So because later on, then you also mentioned attending the Catholic Church with some other French people. So
Yeah.
was Frederick one of those spots where French people from Saint-Domingue fled here? And because I was thinking about, they were known for their violence, because like Baron de Vaté, a Haitian intellectual, documented, so much of their bloodthirsty
Right, yeah.
practices. So was Frederick a hot spot for fleeing Saint-Domingue enslavers?
It's a good question. We didn't look broadly at that history because we were really focused on slavery in the city of Frederick. We just kind of encountered the Vincendiaires in the course of our research. It'd be an interesting question for someone to look into, not only Frederick County, but also more broadly the state of Maryland,
Okay.
even the Mid-Atlantic.
Then one more unrelated question. How often did enslaved people interact with free black people? So like in the course of like work or whatever else, like what kind of labor were free black people doing and were they interacting with?
It's a good question, and it is something that we looked at a little bit. It's the sort of thing that's hard to really understand without written sources to kind of provide a clearer picture, but there was definitely interaction as I presented, as we learned in our research. Enslaved persons, it varied owner to owner, but in some cases they were afforded some mobility. They were allowed to come into town and interact with other people. We know that they more than likely worshiped together at churches like Quinn Chapel. So there was some interaction, and I didn't get into this in the presentation, but there's also a phenomenon known as quote unquote living out that you come across in certain urban environments where enslavers would actually allow their enslaved workers to live off the property. You can go rent a place, or you can go, and sometimes we think that they may have resided with kin who were free, and there may have been some interaction there also in that area. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Yeah, indeed, that did occur.
I think it's also important to point out that in 1860, 3/4 of the African Americans who lived in Frederick were free.
Right, yes, a large free black population, which, led to a lot of the tensions that you saw later in the 19th century, because the large free black population made the white elite class nervous. And that's what directly led to things like the Colonization Society.
Was there any research done on trying to look at renting out and hiring practices? I know a lot of documents, it's easy to look at ownership and sale, but like Frederick City had a lot of people that were rented from off of plantations and other places, and a harder way to track probably, but was there any of that in your report?
Yeah, that is something that's hard to track, but we did run across it in a few instances, and it definitely happened. And I think I mentioned that in the presentation. I believe it was Elizabeth Luckett at the Taney House, an enslaved individual, worked at the Antietam Iron Works, I believe. So she was renting people out. So yeah, it did take place. It's just something that's kind of hard to document, but would be a great research project.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask, so the numbers you've been citing have been about the city of Frederick, right?
Yes.
Could you explain for some of us how that differs from today's concept of city of Frederick? Like, is there a particular range of streets or part of the core of the town where these numbers are relevant? I think that would help us also, because many of us are thinking that seems low, this number of enslaved people, but what are those parameters?
Right, yeah, that's actually a really good point, and that would explain why, because it was a smaller geographic area there then. I apologize, I'm not really, I should know this, but I'm not exactly certain what the boundaries were then relative to today. Obviously, it's bigger today than it was then. But yeah, that is definitely a good point.
Just to give you a visual context, so our historic district is the historic city of Frederick. So 7th, 8th, 9th Street's probably like your northernmost limit. And then really, you're not going to get anything much more south than All Saints, South Street. And after that, really quickly turned to farmland. So that kind of gives you, this is a tight area that we're talking about here, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation as well. My name is Linda Parker, and I have a couple of questions. How prevalent was the Underground Railroad here in Frederick?
Very good question. It was definitely active, and there was stuff going on. It's so hard for historians to document that. It's so hard. But folks, there has been some research. You know, it's a little problematic. A lot of it's based on oral tradition, which is very difficult to confirm. But there are a number of books that some local historians have written on the subject, if you're interested.
Yes.
But again, it's something that's very difficult to confirm. But we do know that there was, you know, it's where Frederick County is situated geographically, kind of made it a go-between between, you know, northern Virginia and southern Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And I think we did discuss in the report that there was kind of a known slave route that kind of skirted along the edge of the mountains to the west of Frederick. But there were definitely sites in the city of Frederick as well.
I don't know if these are anecdotal, but I've heard of certain homes, particularly here in Frederick, housing the Underground Railroad. In fact, I have a friend who owned a house, and she liked to point out to us, she used to own an art gallery here in Frederick. Her name was Renee. And her house is right there on the corner, right across the street from the School for the Deaf, that corner house. And she used to take us down in her basement and show us some remnants of what it could appear to be. I don't know if that's a historical fact, but yeah.
It's tough, you know, a lot of times where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah.
You know, it definitely happened. It was definitely taking place here. It's just something that's very difficult as historians to document in a formal way.
Yes, thank you.
You talked about the population from about 1824 to 1860. Was it a small community in Frederick that was the slave owners, or did the families keep changing? Did you see that disperse across the population, or you know, like a small subset of the Frederick population controlled the slave ownership of Frederick City?
I would say that that is a fair characterization. A lot of this activity was hereditary. Individuals were passed like property. And so we do see a kind of an elite class that engaged in this activity primarily. So yes, that is true.
I was wondering if ground penetrating radar has been used on any of the burial grounds to date them, and I don't know when there were burial grounds that were covered over, paved over, if there was any sort of assessment done before they were paved over.
I'm not privy to that information. It's a very good question.
So in terms of ground penetrating radar, the only example that it's not a common, even though it's a really great technique, in Maryland it's not a common archaeological technique, but we do have an example that was recently done about 2 years ago at the Alms House. And the Alms House is, one, just a fascinating site because you both have white populations and black populations that were living together but segregated. And it's very likely, just like what we've seen at the All Saints Cemetery, they were most likely segregated as well. And really, without the records and without any markers, the ground penetrating radar is probably the best evidence that we're going to see in terms of patterns. And I think what the challenge and limiting factor of ground penetrating radar without records is that you can see the patterns and you can kind of make guesses and assumptions what those patterns means. But that's the challenge with African American history. Without the documents, you can make good guesses in theories, but we're never going to know the full story, unfortunately. I see one more hand, and I say, let's.
I'm really happy that the city commissioned this work, and I hope that there's going to be follow-up and reparation of some kind. So I'm presuming you'll tell us about that in the future. But I do have a question. I just happened to go to Heritage Frederick recently and found out that like the first 3 owners of that beautiful building were enslavers. Is that not included in your research, or is that going to be supplemented somewhere?
Well, it's a good question. We would have loved to have, if we had had more time, we would have loved to have looked at a lot more sites than we did. But that is kind of the nature of historical research. And we look forward to others, carrying the torch and continuing this to tell these stories and to learn about these locations so that we can all know more about this aspect of Frederick's history.
Thank you again, John, so much.
Thank you.
So before everybody goes, I just again, thank you for your appreciation and interest. Sometimes you work on these projects and you don't know if anybody else sees the value in it, and you coming out and taking your time from your evening really means so much for the team who put so much time and thought and care into this. So thank you, 1, for caring. 2, this is not it. We are not done. There's just so much good work to do, and even when that project is done, I know there's going to be more and more work. Like we mentioned earlier, this is the foundational effort for a much larger body of research and effort that needs to take place. So thank you so much for being a part of it. I do hope that you included your name and contact information, because we're looking for people for phase 2 to become more involved in this education and outreach effort. And if you think that you can lend a hand, if you have some sort of specialty, if you have a family story that you think might be helpful and help illustrating our history, I want to hear from you. You'll be hearing from me if you give me your name and contact. So thank you again so much for coming. It has been a wonderful evening. Have a good night. Great job. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming.